My husband looked me dead in the eyes, sliding a thick manila folder across the mahogany table, and told the entire room he was divorcing me because he was entirely too successful to keep carrying a financial burden. To ensure maximum humiliation, he snatched my phone, dialed my mother on speaker, and demanded she come collect her useless daughter. He expected a tearful apology. He expected begging. Instead, my mother pulled up to his gated estate moments later with a private security detail and a convoy of 5 custom black Cadillac Escalades, leaving my ex-husband and his arrogant family absolutely paralyzed. My name is Jasmine, and for 7 years I dimmed my own light to play the role of a quiet, supportive wife. But as I sat in that dining room surrounded by people who despised me, I realized my performance was officially over. The Sunday dinner at my in-laws' sprawling Atlanta estate was a weekly exercise in endurance. The house itself was a monument to new money and over-leveraged debt, with crystal chandeliers that hung a little too low and marble floors that echoed every harsh word. Terrence sat at the head of the table, swirling an expensive bourbon he bought to impress his older brother Malik. I sat quietly picking at my food, wearing a simple beige sweater that blended into the background. That was exactly how Terrence preferred me, invisible and compliant. He cleared his throat loudly, signaling that he was about to hold court. The room fell silent. Malik leaned back in his chair with a familiar smirk, already anticipating the punchline of whatever joke Terrence was about to make at my expense. Malik's wife, Chloe, a white woman who had married into the family and immediately adopted an insufferable air of cultural authority, swirled her wineglass and stared at me with undisguised pity. Terrence did not ease into his cruelty. He tossed the heavy manila folder directly onto my lap. It hit my thighs with a dull thud. The divorce papers were already signed on the last page in his aggressive, sprawling handwriting. I looked from the folder to his face, feeling the sudden heavy silence of the room press down on my shoulders. Terrence took a sip of his bourbon and smiled, a cold, practiced expression he usually reserved for hostile corporate negotiations. He announced to the table that he was officially cutting his losses. He claimed he was on the verge of a massive career-defining acquisition at his private equity firm, and a high-powered executive could not be weighed down by a stagnant, underachieving wife. He called me a charity case, who lacked the drive and vision necessary to stand beside a man of his caliber. Malik chuckled, shaking his head in agreement as he sliced into his steak. Chloe leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her tone dripping with that specific brand of condescension she reserved exclusively for me. She sighed and said that some women just are not built for the corporate hustle, and that there is no shame in returning to a simple life. She suggested I look into administrative work, maybe finding a nice quiet receptionist job where I would not feel so overwhelmed by the demands of a wealthy household. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I calmly reached for my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip, allowing the cold liquid to ground me. My total lack of a breakdown irritated Terrence. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to fall apart so he could justify his narrative of me being a weak, emotional burden. Enraged by my silence, Terrence reached across the table and snatched my phone from right next to my plate. He unlocked it, holding it up like a trophy. He declared that since I was too stunned to speak, he would do me the favor of calling my mother to come retrieve her charity case. He tapped the screen, finding my mother Josephine in my contacts, and hit the speaker button, setting the phone back down in the center of the table. The dial tone echoed loudly in the vast dining room. Chloe covered her mouth to hide a laugh, while Malik leaned in, eager for the show. They expected a panicked mother. They expected tears and confusion. Josephine answered on the second ring. Her voice resonated from the small speaker, crisp, aristocratic, and chillingly calm. Terrence puffed out his chest, leaning toward the microphone. He spoke with the exaggerated arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. He told my mother that he was done carrying dead weight. I demanded she drive over immediately and pick up her useless daughter, boasting that he was officially moving on to bigger and better things and could no longer be shackled to mediocrity. He finished his rant with a smug sigh, waiting for her to crumble. There was a brief pause on the line. Josephine did not raise her voice. She did not ask for an explanation or demand to speak to me. Her tone was like ice slipping over polished steel. She simply asked him to confirm the gate code and the exact street address of his estate. Terence recited the information with a mocking grin, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice. Josephine replied that she would handle the retrieval and ended the call without another word. The abrupt dial tone filled the room. Terence threw his head back and laughed loudly, a harsh, booming sound that Malik immediately joined. Chloe wiped a tear of amusement from her eye, whispering loudly enough for me to hear that Josephine would probably pull up in a broken-down sedan, leaking oil all over their pristine imported brick driveway. Terence told me to go wait by the front door, because he did not want me ruining the rest of his evening. I remained in my seat, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I knew something they did not. I knew exactly who Josephine was. The laughter around the table was abruptly cut short by a low, powerful vibration. It started as a subtle rumble in the floorboards and quickly grew into a deep, synchronized roar that shook the tall dining room windows. Terence frowned, standing up from his chair and walking toward the front window. Malik followed him, holding his napkin. I stayed perfectly still, watching the realization wash over their faces in real time. Through the glass, they saw headlights cutting fiercely through the dark evening. It was not a single car. It was 5 custom black Cadillac Escalades, pulling up the long, winding driveway in flawless military formation. The vehicles were massive, pristine, and completely blacked out. They moved with terrifying precision, stopping simultaneously right in front of the grand entrance. Terence stumbled backward, a look of absolute bewilderment replacing his arrogant smirk. Chloe rushed to the window, her mouth dropping open. The doors of the lead and rear vehicles opened perfectly in sync. Men in tailored dark suits with earpieces stepped out, moving with swift professional efficiency. They were a private security detail, and they immediately established a perimeter around the vehicles and the front steps of the estate. Terence stammered, asking Malik who the hell was outside his house. Malik had no words. The center door of the primary Escalade opened. My mother stepped out. Josephine did not look like a woman coming to collect a charity case. She was dressed in a flawless, tailored emerald green suit, her posture radiating decades of generational wealth and unbothered power. She wore no flashy jewelry, only a vintage timepiece that cost more than Terence's entire mortgage. She walked up the front steps, not waiting for an invitation, and the heavy oak front door swung open under the hands of her security team. Josephine stepped into the foyer, her presence instantly sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Terence was paralyzed. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Chloe shrank back against the wall, her earlier condescension vanishing completely under my mother's sharp, calculating gaze. Josephine did not acknowledge Malik. She did not even look at Chloe. She walked right past Terence as if he were nothing more than a piece of uninteresting furniture. She stopped directly in front of me, holding out a pristine designer cashmere coat. I stood up, leaving the divorce papers on the table. I slipped my arms into the coat, feeling the heavy, luxurious fabric settle over my shoulders. I did not look at Terence. I did not need to. As my mother and I turned to leave the silent dining room, Josephine paused near the entryway. She turned her head slightly, fixing Terence with a stare that could freeze boiling water. She adjusted her gloves and casually mentioned that she had recently reviewed his private equity firm's latest quarterly reports. She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a conversational, almost pitying tone. She told him his numbers looked dangerously fragile and suggested he brace himself for a very difficult fiscal year. Terence's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. Josephine turned away, leading me out the front door and down the steps toward the waiting convoy. The security detail opened the door of the center SUV for us and closed it with a heavy, solid thud, shielding us from the stunned silence of the estate. The moment the doors sealed us inside, the dynamic completely shifted. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the suffocating weight of my 7-year performance finally lift from my chest. I dropped the quiet, submissive wife act instantly. I reached into the hidden compartment of the plush leather console and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I opened it, typing in my credentials. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the cabin, displaying the master dashboard of my actual profession. I was not a receptionist. I was not a charity case. I was the sole founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex, a multi-million-dollar boutique venture capital holding firm that operated entirely in the shadows of the financial elite. Josephine poured us both a glass of sparkling water from the vehicle's built-in cooler. She smiled, noting that my timing for the exit was impeccable. I nodded, pulling up Terrence's personal portfolio and the internal data of his current firm. For years I had kept my wealth completely hidden, living well below my means, allowing Terrence to feel like the sole provider because his fragile ego demanded it. But now the gloves were off. I filtered through his aggressive market movements, analyzing his desperation. My screen highlighted a highly confidential impending acquisition. Terrence was planning a massive, desperate play to acquire a cornerstone, logistics and tech firm, aiming to save his floundering career and cement his status as a major player in Atlanta. He was preparing to leverage everything he owned on this single bid. I zoomed in on the ownership structure of the firm he was trying so desperately to buy. A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. I turned the laptop slightly so Josephine could see the screen. Terrence was risking his entire future to acquire a company that was secretly controlled by Vanguard Apex. He was walking directly into my territory, and he had absolutely no idea that the useless daughter he had just thrown away was holding the keys to his entire existence. I sat in the high-back leather chair of my corner office at Vanguard Apex, watching the morning sun slice through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Less than 12 hours had passed since I walked out of my in-laws' dining room, leaving Terrence suffocating in the exhaust of my mother's convoy. I traced the edge of my coffee mug, feeling a strange and beautiful silence wrapping around my mind. For 7 years, I had forced myself to shrink to fit into Terrence's narrow definition of a good wife. I had dimmed my brilliance and downplayed my intellect to protect his incredibly fragile masculinity. I hid my multi-million-dollar venture capital firm behind the guise of a quiet remote administrative consultant, because Terrence needed to believe he was the sole provider. He needed to feel like the king of a castle he could barely afford. Now the performance was officially over. The heavy, stifling costume of the charity case had been shed, and I was finally breathing my own air. My mother Josephine sat across from me, looking immaculate in a tailored ivory suit, reviewing a tablet with the cold precision of a military general. The Vanguard Apex headquarters operated in the shadows of the financial elite, utilizing quiet luxury and absolute discretion. We did not need flashy chandeliers or imported brick driveways to prove our worth. We owned the companies that manufactured those very things. We did not need to guess how Terrence and his family were handling the humiliation of the previous night. The intelligence gathered by my acquisitions team painted a vivid, pathetic picture of their immediate aftermath. Terrence was a man who constructed his entire reality around his own superiority. Confronted with the undeniable display of generational wealth and power, he simply could not process the fact that the woman he had dismissed as useless was exponentially more powerful than he could ever hope to be. According to the internal communications my team legally monitored during our standard due diligence process, Terrence had spent the entire night frantically spinning a new narrative to protect his shattered ego. He told his board members and mutual friends that the 5 black Escalades were nothing more than a theatrical stunt. He convinced himself, and anyone who would listen, that my mother had maxed out a dozen credit cards just to rent a security detail for the evening, desperately trying to save face after her daughter was rightfully dumped. He needed to believe I was a fraud because the alternative meant he had just discarded a gold mine. Chloe was more than happy to feed this delusion. She had always resented my calm demeanor and viewed my silence as a lack of sophistication. She posted a lengthy, deeply passive-aggressive status on her social media, talking about how sad it was when women relied on rented luxury to heal a broken heart. She even told Malik that she recognized the cashmere coat my mother handed me, claiming it was a clever counterfeit from a discount supplier. Malik, always eager to ride his younger brother's coattails, laughed along and assured Terrence he had made the right decision. They huddled together in their echoing, overpriced estate, reinforcing their shared illusion. They needed me to be poor and desperate. If I was not, their entire hierarchy collapsed. Their entire sense of self-worth relied on having someone beneath them to look down upon. Emboldened by this shared fantasy, Terence doubled down on his absolute arrogance. If he believed I was putting on a pathetic show to mask my heartbreak, he needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the apex predator he always claimed to be. My acquisitions director walked into my office and handed me a freshly printed dossier detailing Terrence's market movements from that very morning. How was moving with reckless, aggressive speed toward securing a cornerstone acquisition for his private equity firm. He wanted to purchase a highly lucrative boutique logistics and tech holding to solidify his status as a titan of Atlanta finance. This was the deal he had bragged about at the dinner table. The very deal he claimed made him too important to remain married to a stagnant underachiever. He wanted to dominate the market and make headline news by Friday. What Terrence completely failed to realize in his blind rush for dominance was that he was not playing a game against a faceless corporate entity. He was playing directly against me. I watched the financial data populate across the large monitor on my wall, my satisfaction growing with every red metric that flashed across the screen. Terrence was taking enormous catastrophic risks to ensure he won this bid before anyone else could counteroffer. He was so desperate to prove his untouchable wealth that he was liquidating his safety nets. He leveraged his entire personal portfolio, draining the accounts he had guarded so fiercely during our marriage. He pulled capital from his mutual funds and completely ignored the warnings of his own risk assessment team. He even put up the deed to his sprawling Atlanta estate as collateral, ignoring the fundamental rules of financial preservation. I was betting his entire professional reputation, his home, and his future on this single massive transaction. He believed that securing this acquisition would elevate him to a financial stratosphere where he would never have to think about his supposedly pathetic ex-wife again. He was operating on pure hubris, completely unaware that Vanguard Apex, the holding firm he was so desperately trying to buy from, was entirely owned and operated by me. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers as I watched the digital clock on my monitor tick closer to the submission deadline. Terrence always loved the dramatic flair of a Friday morning corporate victory. He wanted to head into the weekend feeling like a king, untouchable and supreme. My mother looked up from her tablet, a slow, dangerous smile curving her perfectly painted lips. She asked if he had taken the bait yet. I did not even have to answer. A soft chime echoed through the quiet office, signaling a priority incoming transmission. I opened my personal encrypted inbox and watched as the highly classified document loaded onto the screen. It was Terrence's finalized, heavily leveraged, and aggressively binding bid for the acquisition. He had just signed away everything he owned, unknowingly submitting his entire life directly into my hands. I stared at the digital signature on the document. Terrence had boldly stamped his name right at the bottom of the non-disclosure agreement and the preliminary merger bid. The sheer arrogance of his aggressive offer practically bled through the screen. He was demanding a fast-tracked approval process, offering a premium above market value just to bypass standard waiting periods. He wanted this done yesterday. I tapped the silver intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to my senior executive team. I instructed my managing partners to acknowledge receipt of his bid, but to maintain an air of cautious hesitation. We needed to make Terrence work for this. If we accepted too quickly, his innate paranoia might kick in. But if we made him jump through hoops, if we demanded further proof of his liquidity, he would empty every hidden reserve he possessed just to prove he was worthy of sitting at our table. I told my board to request additional collateral, specifically targeting the equity in the estate where he had humiliated me just 48 hours ago. I wanted his home, his cars, and his private stock portfolios wrapped up in this doomed acquisition. My team executed the directives with ruthless efficiency. They did not ask questions about my personal connection to the bidder. At Vanguard Apex, we only cared about the strategic execution of a flawless takeover. Within 20 minutes, my lead analyst messaged me confirming that Terrence had enthusiastically agreed to the newly added collateral demands. I was so blinded by his own greed and his desperate need to prove his dominance that he was willingly handing me the keys to his entire life. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office slid open. My mother Josephine stepped in carrying two sleek manila folders. She looked entirely different from the woman who had orchestrated the convoy rescue at the estate. Today she wore a sharp navy blue suit, her expression radiating pure analytical focus. She took a seat on the velvet sofa opposite my desk, crossing her legs and setting the folders down on the glass table. She asked if our target had taken the final bait. I turned my monitor so she could see the confirmation of his leveraged assets. We shared a quiet look of mutual understanding. The man who had called me useless was currently begging my anonymous corporate entity to take all his money. But Terence was only half of the equation. I had not forgotten the sound of Chloe laughing in that dining room. I had not forgotten the way my sister-in-law looked down her nose at me, telling me I belonged behind a reception desk. She had built her entire personality around making me feel inferior. Josephine tapped the top folder on the table. She mentioned that while I was busy dismantling my ex-husband's financial future, she had directed our private intelligence firm to take a closer look at his family. Chloe had always been desperate for validation in the elite circles of Atlanta. When she married Malik, she thought she was stepping into royalty, but Malik was just a mid-level player riding his younger brother's coattails. To compensate for her husband's mediocrity, Chloe had recently launched a luxury supply chain business. She imported high-end European textiles and raw materials for boutique designers across the Southeast. She paraded this venture around country club luncheons and charity galas, using it as a golden ticket to rub elbows with the women she desperately wanted to impress. She projected the image of a self-made corporate giant, completely ignoring the fact that Terence and Malik had quietly funded her entire startup operation. She thought she was untouchable because she shared their last name. I picked up the dossier Josephine brought. The financial breakdown of her company was laid out in stark, undeniable numbers. On the surface, she was generating impressive revenue. Her social media was flooded with posts about rapid expansion and overwhelming client demand. She was constantly posting videos of herself in tailored suits, walking through warehouses pretending to be a logistics mastermind. But as I dug deeper into the logistical framework of her operation, a glaring structural weakness emerged. Chloe was entirely focused on the aesthetics of being a boss. She cared about the branding, the packaging, and the networking events. She paid absolutely no attention to the foundational mechanics of her own supply chain. She had built a beautiful house of cards on a foundation of sand. I ran my finger down the list of her operational expenses. Every single yard of imported fabric, every custom component she sold to her high-paying clients passed through one specific Port Authority warehouse in Savannah. She had not diversified her shipping routes. She had not secured backup vendors. Her entire business model, from the moment the goods hit American soil to the moment they reached her boutique buyers, relied completely on a single mid-sized freight and logistics supplier. She had tied her entire fragile empire to one weak link, assuming the supply chain would just magically run itself while she attended champagne brunches. I typed the name of the logistics supplier into my terminal, accessing the Vanguard Apex Global Market database. The results populated almost instantly. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thrill. The supplier was struggling with poor management and had quietly filed the preliminary paperwork seeking a corporate buyout. I looked up at my mother, a dangerous smile forming on my face as I realized Chloe's entire business relied on a single critical logistics supplier that was currently up for sale. I needed to finalize the precise details of the logistics buyout before Terence signed his own financial death warrant. I scheduled a working lunch with my lead acquisitions director, Carter, at a notoriously exclusive French restaurant in the heart of Buckhead. It was the kind of establishment where reservations took months to secure, and the valet line was a continuous parade of imported sports cars. I wore a simple charcoal turtleneck and tailored trousers. It was an outfit that looked completely unremarkable to the untrained eye, but the fabric was spun from rare vicuna wool, and the tailoring was done privately in Milan. I no longer needed to hide my wealth from my ex-husband, but I still preferred the quiet, unbothered power of moving silently through very loud spaces. Carter and I sat at a private corner booth reviewing the supplier contracts on his encrypted tablet. We were just finalizing the aggressive terms of the hostile takeover when the hostess led a boisterous group to the large circular table right in the center of the dining room. I did not even have to look up from my screen to know exactly who it was. Chloe had a laugh that was deliberately designed to bounce off the walls and demand attention from everyone in the vicinity. She was draped in designer logos from head to toe, carrying a handbag that screamed of desperate new money. Malik walked a few steps behind her, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They were hosting a lunch for several prominent Atlanta socialites. The exact group of wealthy, connected women Chloe had been desperately trying to impress for the last 5 years. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching them settle into their premium seats. They ordered 3 bottles of expensive champagne before even glancing at the menus. Chloe was holding court, speaking at a volume that essentially forced the neighboring tables to listen to her boast about her latest business ventures. It only took 10 minutes for her to spot me sitting in the corner. I saw the exact moment her eyes locked onto my table. A nasty, triumphant smile spread across her face, illuminating her features with pure malice. In her mind, I was just a discarded, broke ex-wife, eating a sad little lunch, trying to pretend I still belonged in a restaurant I clearly could not afford on my own. She whispered something to Malik, pointing subtly in my direction. Malik smirked and shook his head, telling her to leave it alone. But Chloe was already standing up. She could never resist an opportunity to kick someone she thought was already down on the ground. She walked over to my booth, holding her crystal champagne flute like a royal scepter. She looked down at my simple charcoal sweater and gave a highly theatrical sigh of pity. She loudly greeted me, making absolutely sure the wealthy women at her table were watching the interaction. She told me she was honestly surprised to see me showing my face in public so soon after Terrence kicked me out of the estate. She asked if I was putting my modest lunch on a credit card and offered to pay my bill out of the goodness of her heart. Carter looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he waited for a signal to intervene. I simply smiled and told him to give us a moment. I looked up at Chloe and kept my voice perfectly level. I thanked her for the generous offer but assured her I was doing just fine. Chloe laughed, taking a long sip of her champagne. She leaned against the edge of my booth, projecting her voice so her elite friends could hear every single word. She told me there was no shame in struggling to find my footing after a divorce. She boasted that Terrence was about to close a corporate deal that would make their family virtually untouchable in the financial sector. Then she seamlessly pivoted to her favorite topic, which was her own brilliance. She proudly declared that her new luxury supply chain business was breaking profit records every single month. She bragged that she was currently importing the most exclusive silks in the country and had just locked down 3 major boutique designers who relied entirely on her shipments. She patted my shoulder with a perfectly manicured hand, telling me that maybe if I ever decided to start a little craft business, she could give me some pointers on how real women handle corporate logistics. She was practically vibrating with arrogance. She felt so powerful standing over me, wrapped in her designer labels, bragging about a business she barely understood. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice or defend my current position. I just looked at her with a calm, steady gaze, knowing that her entire reality was about to shatter. I told her I was truly impressed by her rapid expansion and her ability to secure such high-end clients. I calmly picked up my phone from the table. I opened my secure messaging app and navigated to the active chat with my Vanguard Apex board of directors. The preliminary paperwork for the logistics supplier buyout was already queued up and waiting for my final authorization. While Chloe continued to lecture me about the absolute importance of supply chain dominance, I typed a single word into my phone: execute. I hit send. In that exact fraction of a second, Vanguard Apex officially purchased the sole Port Authority warehouse and freight supplier that handled every single piece of inventory Chloe's business relied upon. The acquisition was immediate and absolute. As the new owner of the logistics firm, I had full authority to review all existing vendor contracts and terminate them at my sole discretion. I sent a second rapid message to my legal team, instructing them to instantly dissolve the supplier agreement with Chloe's LLC due to corporate restructuring effective immediately. I set my phone face down on the polished wooden table. I looked up at Chloe, who was still talking animatedly about her upcoming warehouse expansion plans. I smiled warmly and thanked her for the unsolicited advice. I told her it was always fascinating to hear how other people managed their business inventory. I signaled to the waiter and paid for my lunch with a solid black heavy metal corporate card that made Chloe's eyes widen slightly in sudden confusion. I stood up from the booth, smoothing the pristine lines of my trousers. I grabbed my purse and signaled for Carter to follow me toward the exit. I walked right past Chloe, stopping just an inch from her shoulder. The smell of her overly sweet perfume hung heavy in the air. I lowered my voice so only she could hear my next words. I told her that her business model was incredibly ambitious. I complimented her branding and her relentless networking skills. But then I leaned in closer and whispered that she really should have diversified her shipping routes because putting all her faith in one single Savannah port supplier was a very dangerous game to play. Chloe froze completely. The smug, arrogant smile vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden deep and terrifying confusion. She opened her mouth to ask how I knew the specific intimate details of her private supply chain. Before she could even form the words, a sharp, loud notification rang out from the designer purse hanging on her arm. Then another notification chimed loudly. Then three more in rapid succession, blending into a chaotic chorus of digital alarms. I did not wait to watch her read the devastating emails. I walked out of the restaurant with perfect posture, leaving Chloe standing completely still in the middle of the crowded dining room. As I handed my valet ticket to the parking attendant outside the glass doors, I heard a sudden frantic shriek echo from inside the restaurant. Chloe's phone was blowing up with urgent panicked alerts from her warehouse managers, informing her that her sole logistics contract had just been permanently terminated without warning, and her entire seasonal inventory was officially stranded at the port. I stepped out of the blinding afternoon sun and into the private climate-controlled elevator that serviced the exclusive top floors of the Vanguard Apex headquarters. The absolute silence of the ascent was a perfect contrast to the frantic, high-pitched shrieks I had just left behind in the restaurant dining room. Chloe was currently drowning in the reality of her ruined supply chain, but my focus had already shifted back to the primary target. Her destruction was merely a necessary operational adjustment. The true execution required my presence back in the boardroom. The digital transaction had frozen her inventory at the port, but the permanence of my newly acquired power required physical signatures. I walked through the frosted glass doors of my executive suite, where my chief acquisitions director Jamal was already waiting. Spread across the massive polished obsidian table were the thick, legally binding hard copies of the logistics firm buyout. Jamal handed me a customized silver pen, his expression entirely professional, but carrying a subtle trace of profound satisfaction. I leaned over the dark surface of the table and signed my name on the dotted lines, officially securing Vanguard Apex as the sole owner of the largest Port Authority warehouse in the region. The ink dried in seconds. It was a simple administrative motion that permanently eradicated my sister-in-law's carefully constructed socialite facade. She had mocked my modest clothing and belittled my career while sitting entirely unaware that my signature was actively dismantling her access to the global market. I handed the pen back to Jamal and instructed him to have our legal department immediately draft the formal termination notices for all associated vendors connected to her limited liability company. I wanted the paperwork delivered to her home address by a courier, requiring a direct signature, just so her husband Malik would have to look the messenger in the eye when the reality of their massive new debt was handed to them. With Chloe neutralized, I moved to the head of the boardroom table and tapped the control panel. The large smart glass wall turned opaque, instantly displaying the comprehensive financial breakdown of Terrence's final merger bid. My risk assessment team had been scrutinizing his submissions all morning. Terrence had always fancied himself an apex predator in the corporate finance world, but his strategy on the screen read like the desperate flailing of a man terrified of losing his status. To meet the inflated collateral demands my board had purposefully instituted, he had completely abandoned all basic principles of wealth preservation. The data illuminated exactly how far he was willing to go to secure this acquisition. How was utilizing extreme mezzanine, financing collateralizing his personal assets with his firm's leveraged debt. He believed the return on investment would be so astronomical that the temporary risk was justified. Jamal pulled up the specific schedule of assets Terrence had officially pledged to Vanguard Apex to back his aggressive bid. My eyes scanned the list, and a cold, heavy sense of vindication settled deep in my chest. Right at the top of the itemized collateral was the deed to the sprawling Atlanta estate. It was the exact same property where he had publicly humiliated me just days prior. For 7 years, Terrence had used that house as a psychological weapon against me. Whenever we had a minor disagreement, he would loudly remind me that his name was on the mortgage, that his income paid for the imported brick driveway, and that I was essentially a guest living under his roof by his grace. He had thrown those divorce papers onto my lap in that echoing dining room, fully believing he was discarding a useless financial burden. Now his arrogant signature on this merger bid had legally handed the deed of that very house directly into my corporate holding portfolio. He had pledged his luxury vehicles, his offshore investment accounts, and the entirety of his liquid savings. He was walking right into a meticulously constructed financial trap, and he was doing it with a smug smile on his face. I instructed Jamal to formally accept the collateral pledge and push the merger to the final stage of execution. Terrence was now entirely locked into the agreement. If the merger failed to close, or if Vanguard Apex rejected his final terms on the grounds of structural default, we maintained the legal right to instantly seize every single asset he had pledged. He had handed me the absolute legal authority to render him homeless and destitute. The heavy boardroom doors opened, and my mother Josephine walked in. She moved with her usual effortless grace, carrying an elegant, thick black envelope embossed with gold foil. She placed it on the obsidian table right next to the finalized logistics contracts. She looked at the digital breakdown of Terrence's collateral on the screen and gave a slow, approving nod. She stated that it was always fascinating to watch an arrogant man finance his own absolute destruction. I picked up the black envelope and slid my finger under the gold seal. It was an exclusive VIP invitation to the Atlanta Global Innovators Gala. This was the most prestigious corporate event of the season, a highly restricted gathering where the true titans of industry venture capital and elite social circles converged. Josephine took a seat at the table, smoothing the line of her immaculate skirt. She informed me that her private intelligence network had just confirmed Terrence's plans for the evening. Emboldened by our strategic acceptance of his collateral, he genuinely believed the merger was a guaranteed victory. He had booked a premium table right near the center stage of the gala. He was aggressively telling his partners, his competitors, and his elite mutual friends that he planned to use the event to publicly celebrate his monumental new acquisition. He intended to stand under the crystal chandeliers and toast to his own unmatched brilliance. He was treating the evening as his ultimate coronation. He wanted to show the city that dropping his dead-weight wife had propelled him into the financial stratosphere. I looked down at the embossed gold lettering on the invitation, feeling the quiet thrum of absolute power coursing through my veins. For years I had avoided these high society galas because Terrence always insisted my quiet demeanor embarrassed him in rooms full of sharks. He had actively hidden me away, convinced I lacked the sophistication to stand beside him in the spotlight. He preferred to parade around with Malik and Chloe, maintaining his illusion of unchecked dominance. I looked up at Josephine and slid the invitation back across the table. I told my mother that it was finally time for us to step entirely out of the shadows. Terrence wanted an audience to witness his spectacular rise to the top of the financial food chain. I decided it was only fair that I grant him that exact audience to witness his absolute eradication. I instructed my executive team to clear my schedule for the following evening. I was going to attend the Atlanta Global Innovators Gala, not as a submissive hidden wife, but as the majority shareholder who legally owned the ground he was standing on. The trap was set, the collateral was locked, and the stage was perfectly illuminated for the final reckoning. The Atlanta Global Innovators Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the city's corporate social calendar. It was a fiercely guarded environment where multi-million-dollar deals were brokered over plates of seared wagyu and glasses of vintage champagne. For the 7 years of my marriage, Terrence had explicitly forbidden me from attending this specific event. He would always offer the same patronizing excuse, claiming the atmosphere was too cutthroat for my sensitive nature, and that my quiet disposition would be a liability in a room full of aggressive industry sharks. I knew the truth. He wanted to parrot around as a wealthy bachelor, unburdened by the wife he deemed too ordinary for his curated image. Tonight, however, I was not asking for an invitation, and I certainly was not asking for his permission. My mother, Josephine, and I arrived at the grand entrance of the downtown luxury hotel in one of the black Escalades from our private fleet. I stepped out of the vehicle and let the cool evening air wash over me. The woman who used to shrink into beige sweaters and sensible flats was completely gone. In her place stood the majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly across my skin, reflecting a quiet, undeniable luxury. The fabric caught the light with every step, radiating the kind of effortless generational wealth that could never be faked or rented. I wore no flashy logos and no oversized diamonds. My power was woven into the absolute precision of my tailoring and the unwavering confidence in my posture. The heavy gilded doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and I stepped onto the polished marble floor. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening wear. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the hundreds of elite guests. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the ruthless corporate networking happening all around them. Josephine walked smoothly by my side, her own presence demanding immediate silent respect from the seasoned financial veterans who recognized her. We moved through the crowd, not rushing, not searching, simply existing in a space that I legally owned a significant portion of. It did not take long to spot my ex-husband. Terrence was holding court near the center of the room, positioned exactly where the lighting was most flattering. He was surrounded by a circle of key industry stakeholders, potential investors, and senior partners from his firm. He held a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, gesturing broadly with the other, as he laughed at his own jokes. He was vibrating with an almost frantic, arrogant energy. He truly believed he was the king of the world tonight. I was treating the gala as his personal victory lap, convinced that his finalized merger bid with Vanguard Apex was a guaranteed success that would cement his legacy. Standing right beside him was his brother Malik, nodding along to every word like a dutiful shadow. And clinging to Malik's arm was Chloe. Even from across the room, I could see the severe tension radiating from my former sister-in-law. She was wearing a heavily beaded gold dress that was far too loud for the sophisticated atmosphere of the gala. She was overcompensating. I knew exactly why she was gripping her champagne flute so tightly, her knuckles were turning white. Less than 30 hours ago, I had completely frozen her supply chain. Her boutique logistics business was currently bleeding capital. Her inventory was locked at the port, and her high-paying clients were undoubtedly demanding answers she did not have. Yet there she was, forcing a rigid smile, trying desperately to project the image of a thriving corporate powerhouse while her entire business model burned to the ground. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a towering floral arrangement that offered a clear view of Terrence's inner circle. I did not try to hide. I simply waited for the inevitable moment when their eyes would scan the room and find me. It happened almost beautifully. Terrence turned his head to laugh at a comment made by one of his investors, and his gaze swept casually across the perimeter of the ballroom. His eyes locked onto mine, and I watched the laugh die instantly in his throat. His entire body went rigid. The arrogant posture he had been projecting deflated for a fraction of a second as sheer absolute shock registered on his face. He blinked rapidly, staring at me as if I were an apparition. He could not reconcile the stunning, poised woman standing across the room with the submissive charity case he had thrown out of his dining room a few days ago. Chloe noticed his sudden paralysis and followed his line of sight. Her reaction was entirely different. Where Terrence showed shock, Chloe showed immediate visceral anger. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, contrasting horribly with her gold dress. Seeing me standing in the exact elite space she fought so hard to infiltrate, looking completely unbothered and dripping in the kind of quiet luxury she could never emulate, triggered her deepest insecurities. She tapped Malik aggressively on the shoulder, pointing in my direction. I watched them huddle together, a quick, frantic whispering session, disrupting their triumphant circle. Terrence's ego simply could not handle my presence. In his mind, this gala was his territory. I was supposed to be at home crying over his absence, begging for his financial support. Showing up to his victory lap looking immaculate was a direct insult to his authority. I saw his jaw clench. He set his scotch glass down on a passing tray and squared his shoulders. He signaled to Chloe, and the two of them began marching across the ballroom floor, navigating through the crowd with aggressive intent. Malik trailed behind them, looking deeply uncomfortable. They were approaching with the singular goal of putting me back in my place. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to publicly remind me that I did not belong in a room full of executives and industry titans. They wanted to reestablish the hierarchy that made them feel so powerful. I did not retreat. I stood my ground, holding my glass of water, maintaining a calm, detached expression as they closed the distance between us. Terrence reached me first, stopping uncomfortably close, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. He looked me up and down, a nasty sneer forming on his lips. Before he could even open his mouth to deliver whatever cruel insult he had prepared, Chloe pushed past him. She wanted the spotlight. She needed to assert her dominance, especially after the silent terror of her failing business had been gnawing at her all day. Chloe planted her feet, adjusting her loud gold dress, and raised her chin. She deliberately elevated her voice, ensuring that the key industry stakeholders and prominent investors standing at the adjacent tables could hear every single word she was about to say. She looked at me with an expression of exaggerated theatrical disgust and loudly questioned how a desperate charity case managed to sneak past the security team into a heavily restricted VIP corporate event. The air outside the grand ballroom of the Buckhead Plaza Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and imported orchids. For 7 years, Terrence had explicitly forbidden me from attending the Atlanta Global Innovators Gala. He would always use that same patronizing tone, telling me the atmosphere was far too aggressive for my delicate sensibilities, claiming I would simply embarrass him in a room filled with corporate sharks. I used to accept that lie, staying home in my oversized sweatpants, convincing myself I preferred the quiet. The reality was that he wanted to parade around as a wealthy, unburdened bachelor, hiding the wife he deemed too ordinary for his carefully curated image. Tonight, however, I did not need his permission, and I certainly was not asking for an invitation. I stepped out of the back of my private black Escalade and let the cool evening breeze wash over me. The woman who used to shrink into beige sweaters and sensible flats was completely gone. In her place stood the majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly across my skin. The fabric caught the light with every step, radiating the kind of effortless generational wealth that could never be faked or rented. I wore no flashy logos and no oversized diamonds. My power was woven entirely into the absolute precision of my tailoring and the unwavering confidence in my posture. The heavy gilded doors swung open, and I stepped onto the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. The space was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer evening wear. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of elite guests. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the ruthless corporate networking happening all around them. I moved through the crowd smoothly, not rushing, not searching, simply existing in a space where I legally owned a significant portion of the leverage in the room. Waiters offered trays of champagne and seared Wagyu hors d'oeuvres, and I accepted a glass of sparkling water, moving with a quiet, undeniable luxury. It did not take long to spot my ex-husband. Terrence was holding court near the center of the room, positioned exactly where the lighting was most flattering. He was surrounded by a circle of key industry stakeholders, potential investors, and senior partners from his firm. He held a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, gesturing broadly with the other, as he laughed at his own jokes. He was vibrating with an almost frantic, arrogant energy. He truly believed he was the king of the world tonight. I was treating the gala as his personal victory lap, absolutely convinced that his finalized merger bid with Vanguard Apex was a guaranteed success that would cement his legacy forever. Standing right beside him was his older brother Malik, nodding along to every word like a dutiful shadow. and clinging tightly to Malik's arm was Chloe. Even from across the vast room, I could see the severe, rigid tension radiating from my former sister-in-law. She was wearing a heavily beaded gold dress that was far too loud and flashy for the sophisticated atmosphere of the gala. She was overcompensating. I knew exactly why her knuckles were turning white as she gripped her champagne flute. Less than 30 hours ago, I had completely frozen her supply chain. Her boutique logistics business was currently bleeding capital. Her inventory was locked at the Savannah port, and her high-paying clients were undoubtedly demanding answers she did not have. Yet there she was, forcing a brittle smile, trying desperately to project the image of a thriving corporate powerhouse while her entire business model burned to the ground. I positioned myself near a towering floral arrangement that offered a clear view of Terrence's inner circle. I did not try to hide behind the shadows or avert my gaze. I simply waited for the inevitable moment when their eyes would scan the room and find me. It happened almost beautifully. Terrence turned his head to laugh at a comment made by a prominent venture capitalist, and his gaze swept casually across the perimeter of the ballroom. His eyes locked onto mine, and I watched the laugh die instantly in his throat. His entire body went completely rigid. The arrogant, untouchable posture he had been projecting deflated for a fraction of a second as sheer absolute shock registered on his face. He blinked rapidly, staring at me as if I were a ghost. He could not reconcile the stunning, poised woman standing across the room with the submissive charity case he had thrown out of his dining room just days ago. Chloe noticed his sudden paralysis and followed his line of sight. Her reaction was entirely different. Where Terrence showed pure shock, Chloe showed immediate visceral anger. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, contrasting horribly with her bright gold dress. Seeing me standing in the exact elite space she fought so desperately to infiltrate, looking completely unbothered and dripping in the kind of quiet luxury she could never emulate, triggered her deepest insecurities. She tapped Malik aggressively on the shoulder, pointing directly at me. I watched them huddle together, a quick, frantic whispering session disrupting their triumphant circle. Terrence's fragile ego simply could not handle my presence. In his mind, this gala was his exclusive territory. I was supposed to be at home crying over his absence, begging for his financial support. Showing up to his victory lap looking immaculate was a direct, unforgivable insult to his authority. I saw his jaw clench tightly. He set his scotch glass down on a passing tray with a sharp clink and squared his shoulders. He signaled to Chloe, and the two of them began marching across the ballroom floor, navigating through the sophisticated crowd with aggressive, hostile intent. Malik trailed closely behind them, looking deeply uncomfortable but unwilling to stop them. They were approaching with the singular goal of putting me back in my place. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to publicly remind me that I did not belong in a room full of powerful executives and industry titans. They wanted to reestablish the twisted hierarchy that made them feel so superior. I did not retreat. I stood my ground, holding my glass of water, maintaining a calm, detached expression as they closed the distance between us. Terrence reached me first, stopping uncomfortably close, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. He looked me up and down, a nasty, cruel sneer forming on his lips. But before he could even open his mouth to deliver whatever insult he had prepared, Chloe pushed aggressively past him. She wanted the spotlight. She desperately needed to assert her dominance, especially after the silent terror of her failing business had been gnawing at her sanity all day. Chloe planted her feet, adjusting her loud gold dress, and raised her chin high. She deliberately elevated her voice, ensuring that the key industry stakeholders and prominent investors standing at the adjacent tables could hear every single word she was about to say. She looked at me with an expression of exaggerated theatrical disgust and loudly questioned how a desperate charity case managed to sneak past the security team into a heavily restricted VIP corporate event. The echo of Chloe's shrill voice hung heavy in the air of the grand ballroom. She had practically shouted her question, demanding to know how a charity case like me had managed to sneak past the security team into such an exclusive corporate event. The nearby investors and venture capitalists paused their conversations, turning their heads to witness the spectacle. Terrence stood right beside her, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, fully expecting me to crumble under the weight of their public humiliation. He wanted me to lower my head and run for the exit. He wanted the elite crowd to see him as the powerful executive who had finally shed his pathetic deadweight wife. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I simply took a slow breath and let the heavy silence stretch between us. My absolute lack of reaction completely disrupted their expected script. Chloe thrived on dramatic reactions, but I was giving her absolutely nothing but a cold, unwavering stare. The prominent stakeholders gathered around the adjacent tables stepped slightly closer, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension. Feeling the eyes of the room on her, Chloe decided to double down on her performance. She needed to prove to everyone watching that she was the apex predator. She turned her attention away from me and addressed the wealthy investors standing nearby. She adopted a sickeningly sweet tone, projecting the image of a thriving corporate powerhouse. She began to loudly brag about her luxury logistics company, boasting that she was single-handedly revolutionizing the supply chain for high-end boutiques across the entire Southeast. She threw out inflated revenue numbers and talked about her massive seasonal inventory currently waiting at the Savannah port. She made a point to look back at me while she spoke, using her supposed business success as a weapon to highlight my assumed failure. She told the crowd that it was truly tragic how some people simply lacked the drive and intellectual capacity to build a real enterprise. She gestured toward my midnight blue silk gown, implying that whatever man I had tricked into buying it for me must be incredibly foolish. She laughed a sharp, grating laugh, telling the investors that real wealth was built through strategic operational dominance, not through begging for handouts. Terrence smiled, nodding in agreement with his sister-in-law. He looked around the circle of executives, making sure they were all absorbing the narrative. He chimed in, adding that the business world is entirely unforgiving to those who refuse to elevate themselves. He was positioning himself as the wise titan of industry who had finally curated a circle of winners. Malik stood slightly behind them, puffing his chest out, proud to be associated with such ruthless ambition. I allowed Chloe to speak uninterrupted for a full 2 minutes. I let her build her magnificent house of cards right there in the middle of the ballroom. I let her paint a picture of an unstoppable logistics empire, convincing the powerful men and women around us that she was an invaluable asset to the Atlanta financial scene. The higher she built her pedestal, the more devastating her inevitable fall would be. When she finally paused to take a sip of her champagne, I made my move. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her character or defend my own presence at the gala. I simply opened the clasp of my sleek evening clutch. The movement was so calm and deliberate that it immediately drew the attention of everyone in our immediate circle. I reached inside and withdrew a thick premium black envelope embossed with the gold crest of Vanguard Apex. I held the envelope out toward Chloe. She stared at it, her triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She did not want to take it, but the sheer weight of the moment and the intense curiosity of the surrounding investors compelled her to reach out. She snatched the envelope from my hand, her manicured fingers gripping the thick cardstock. She tried to maintain her condescending smirk, joking to the crowd that perhaps the charity case was handing out resumes. I kept my voice perfectly level, speaking with the quiet, undeniable authority of a woman who held her entire livelihood in the palm of my hand. I told Chloe that I was deeply impressed by her passionate speech regarding the importance of strategic operational dominance. I agreed with her that the business world is incredibly unforgiving to those who fail to recognize their own vulnerabilities. Chloe ripped open the gold seal of the envelope. She pulled out the heavy legal documents. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background as her eyes scanned the first page. I watched the exact moment her reality fractured. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white. Her eyes darted frantically across the legal text, searching for a loophole that did not exist. I took a single step closer to her, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the investors who were watching her sudden physical collapse. I calmly explained that her entire business model relied exclusively on one mid-sized freight and logistics supplier at the Savannah port. I noted that she had built her entire operation on a single point of failure. I then informed her that less than 48 hours ago, my holding company Vanguard Apex had officially acquired that exact logistics firm in a hostile cash buyout. Chloe began to shake uncontrollably. The thick, expensive paper rattled in her grip. Terence frowned, leaning over her shoulder to read the documents, but he could not comprehend the legal jargon fast enough. He demanded to know what I was talking about, but I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Chloe. I told her that as the new sole owner of her only supply chain, I had conducted a thorough review of all existing vendor agreements. I informed her that I found her limited liability company to be a high-risk, poorly managed liability. I kept my tone conversational, almost polite, as I delivered the final devastating blow. I stated clearly that the documents she was holding constituted the official immediate termination of her logistics contract. I explained that her massive seasonal inventory, the same inventory she had just been bragging about to the elite investors surrounding us, was officially stranded at the port. I told her that she no longer had a distributor, a warehouse, or a functional business model. I informed her that Vanguard Apex had permanently frozen her access to the global market effective immediately. The silence that descended upon our circle was absolute and suffocating. The prominent stakeholders and venture capitalists who had just been listening to her boastful speech instantly grasped the magnitude of what had just occurred. They were seasoned corporate predators, and they recognized a bloodbath when they saw one. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled, gasping sound emerged. Her champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the polished marble floor, sending crystal shards and expensive alcohol splashing across the toes of Malik's shoes. Malik looked down at the broken glass and then up at his wife, his own face twisting in sudden dawning panic as he realized the financial implications of her failure. Chloe looked at me with eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The illusion of her success had been violently ripped away, leaving her exposed as a complete fraud. She had spent the last 5 years using her husband's money to build a facade of corporate brilliance, and I had dismantled every single piece of it with one signature. The investors standing around us reacted with brutal swiftness. In the corporate world, proximity to a failing entity is a massive liability. The men and women who had been smiling and nodding at Chloe just seconds prior physically took a synchronized step backward. They distanced themselves from her, creating a visible ring of isolation around her Malik and Terence. They looked at me with a sudden, profound respect, realizing that the woman they had assumed was a party crasher had just executed a flawless corporate assassination in the middle of a cocktail reception. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, clutching the termination papers as she fully realized her entire business model had been completely annihilated in less than 60 seconds. Malik stared at the shattered crystal at his feet and then looked up at his wife. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, his fingers sinking into her skin, shaking her slightly as he demanded to know what was happening. Malik had co-signed every single one of her business loans, using his own heavily leveraged real estate portfolio as collateral. By permanently freezing her supply chain, I had effectively zeroed out her revenue stream, ensuring she would default on her next payment cycle. That default would instantly trigger a margin call on Malik's debt, stripping him of everything he owned. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror as he realized he was going down with her ship. The elite investors surrounding us watched the marital breakdown with cold, calculating interest. In their world, weakness was contagious, and they were already mentally calculating how to strip Malik of his remaining assets. This was the exact moment Terence realized he was losing control of the room. The narrative he had spent months curating, the image of the untouchable affluent brotherhood, was disintegrating right in front of the very people he needed to impress. Terence could not handle the shift in power. He stepped aggressively in front of his brother, physically placing himself between me and the wreckage of Chloe's pride. Terence forced a loud, booming laugh that echoed harshly against the high ceilings of the ballroom. It was a desperate, theatrical sound completely devoid of any genuine amusement. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture, turning his attention directly to the retreating venture capitalists. He told them to pay no mind to the hysterical theatrics of a bitter ex-wife. He pointed a finger at me, his face contorting into a nasty, condescending sneer. He loudly declared that I was simply throwing a temper tantrum because he had finally cut the dead weight out of his life. He called my strategic acquisition of the Port Authority a lucky petty business game financed by whoever I had tricked into paying for my makeover. He looked me up and down, openly mocking the midnight blue silk gown I wore. He told the crowd that playing dress-up and pulling a minor administrative stunt might impress amateur-hour executives, but it meant absolutely nothing in the real world of corporate finance. He projected his voice, ensuring it carried to the adjacent tables, actively trying to diminish my presence by painting me as a scorned, emotionally unstable woman lashing out at her superiors. I stood perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me. His words had no power anymore. They were just the hollow echoes of a man terrified of his own impending irrelevance. Sensing that the crowd was still skeptical, Terence decided to deploy his ultimate weapon. He needed to re-establish his dominance and remind the room that he was the apex predator. He straightened his tuxedo jacket and puffed out his chest, his voice dripping with an almost intoxicating level of arrogance. He smoothly pivoted the conversation away from Chloe's ruined logistics company and directed the spotlight onto his own impending triumphs. He announced to the gathered stakeholders that while some people wasted their time on petty supply chain disputes, he was busy securing the future of the Atlanta financial sector. He bragged that his private equity firm was less than 48 hours away from finalizing a monumental cornerstone acquisition. He boasted that this new merger would elevate him into a financial stratosphere that a simple-minded charity case like me could never even begin to comprehend. He told the room that he was acquiring a multi-million-dollar boutique tech and holding firm that would grant him unprecedented market control. I was so drunk on his own hubris that he began making wild, aggressive promises to the investors standing nearby. He publicly bet his entire professional reputation on the deal closing smoothly by Friday morning. He looked the most prominent venture capitalist in the eye and swore that by next week his firm would dictate the terms of engagement for the entire southeastern region. Terence smiled at me, a cold, triumphant expression that mirrored the one he wore when he tossed those divorce papers onto my lap. He told me to take a good long look at a real titan of industry, because after Friday I would never be allowed in the same zip code as him again. I was practically vibrating with self-satisfaction, believing he had effectively put me back in my place and restored his family's honor. He thought his grand speech had secured his throne. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute his final destruction. I did not raise my voice to match his shouting. I did not engage in a public shouting match or defend my corporate intellect. The most powerful moves in business are never broadcast to the entire room. They are delivered quietly with surgical precision. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing directly in his personal space. Terence stiffened, his triumphant smile faltering slightly as he caught the cold, dead expression in my eyes. I was so close I could smell the sharp, expensive bourbon on his breath and see the tiny bead of nervous sweat forming at his temple. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my gaze locked onto his pupils. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, quiet whisper, ensuring that only he could hear the words leaving my lips. I did not insult him. I did not mock his arrogance or his desperate need for validation. I simply recited the numbers. I spoke the exact highly confidential financial figures of his supposedly private bid. I whispered the precise valuation of $72.5 million. I casually mentioned the 19% interest rate on his mezzanine financing. I recited the specific cross-collateralization terms he had agreed to, explicitly naming the offshore accounts he had liquidated. And then, with a slow, devastating smile, I whispered the exact address of the sprawling Atlanta estate he had blindly pledged as his final guarantee. I watched the blood completely drain from Terence's face as he realized I knew the most intimate, heavily guarded secrets of his entire existence. Terence physically recoiled. He stumbled backward a half step, the heel of his polished Italian leather shoe scraping awkwardly against the smooth marble floor. The confident, booming titan of industry, who had just been holding court, was entirely gone. In his place stood a man completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that his absolute worst nightmare was standing right in front of him. The blood had rushed out of his face so fast, he looked physically ill. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked left and right, his eyes darting frantically around the ballroom, as if searching for hidden cameras or a rational explanation for the impossible reality he was facing. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence do the work for me. For 7 years, he had used his financial literacy as a weapon to keep me subjugated. He had spoken to me in circles using complex market jargon to make me feel small and uneducated. Hearing those exact confidential metrics fall from my lips in a space where he thought he was untouchable completely short-circuited his brain. When he finally managed to find his voice, it was not a roar of authority. It was a breathless, panicked hiss. He demanded to know how I had obtained that information. His mind, conditioned by years of deep-seated misogyny, immediately jumped to the only conclusion his fragile ego could process. He leaned in, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and fear, and accused me of corporate espionage. He demanded to know which managing partner at Vanguard Apex I was sleeping with. He asked me how I had manipulated my way into their boardroom, genuinely believing that the only way a woman like me could access top-tier financial data was by leveraging herself to a powerful man. I did not get angry at the insult. I simply smiled. It was a slow, pitying smile that cut far deeper than any shouting match ever could. I looked at him like he was a confused, slow child, attempting to understand a concept vastly beyond his intellectual capacity. I told him that his inability to see women as anything other than accessories was exactly why his firm was bleeding capital. I told him he always underestimated the people he deemed beneath him, and that fatal flaw was about to cost him everything he had ever worked for. Malik and Chloe were standing just a few feet away, practically vibrating with anxious energy. Chloe was still clutching the termination papers that had just annihilated her luxury logistics business, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Malik stepped forward, grabbing his younger brother by the shoulder, demanding to know what I had just said to make him look so terrified. Malik needed Terrence to be strong right now. Malik needed a bailout to cover the massive debt he had leveraged on Chloe's ruined supply chain. But Terrence completely ignored his brother. He violently shrugged Malik's hand off his shoulder, his eyes remaining locked on me in pure, unadulterated panic. I calmly adjusted the clasp of my evening clutch, smoothing the line of my midnight blue silk gown. I had delivered the necessary blow. There was no need to linger in his toxic orbit any longer. But before I turned to walk away, I decided to leave him with one final piece of advice. I stepped slightly closer again, ensuring my voice remained a soft, dangerous whisper that only he could hear. I told him that before he signed away the rest of his pathetic existence on Friday morning, he really needed to instruct his legal team to do their actual jobs. I dropped a final cryptic, advising him to stop looking at the superficial shell companies and to read the fine print on Vanguard Apex's ownership structure. I told him to look very closely at the primary signatory of the holding firm he was begging to do business with. I stepped back, allowing the physical distance to finalize the end of our interaction. Terrence was sweating profusely now. A bead of perspiration rolled down the side of his face, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. His chest rose and fell rapidly under his bespoke tuxedo. He was cornered, backed against the wall of his own monumental arrogance. I turned my back on him. I did not wait for a response. I walked away with the slow, measured grace of a woman who completely owned the ground she walked on. I navigated through the crowd of elite stakeholders and prominent venture capitalists, the same people who had just watched Terrence completely unravel. They parted ways for me, stepping aside with a new, profound sense of respect. They did not know exactly what I had whispered to the self-proclaimed king of Atlanta finance, but they knew a corporate execution when they saw one. I rejoined my mother, Josephine, who was waiting near the grand gilded doors of the ballroom. She did not ask how the interaction went. One look at my calm, elevated posture told her everything she needed to know. We walked out of the Buckhead Plaza Hotel together, leaving the heavy, desperate energy of my former family trapped inside the echoing hall. Back in the center of the ballroom, Terrence was actively drowning in his own hubris. Through the intelligence reports my team later gathered, I learned exactly how he handled the aftermath of my departure. Malik was practically begging him for a financial lifeline, frantically explaining that Chloe's business had just been seized and their personal assets were about to be liquidated by aggressive creditors. Terrence, entirely consumed by his own impending crisis, screamed at his brother to back off. Terrence looked around the room, feeling the heavy, judgmental stares of the investors he had just been bragging to. He had publicly bet his entire professional reputation on this merger closing by Friday. He had stood in the center of the elite crowd and sworn that his new acquisition would elevate his firm to untouchable heights. If he pulled out of the Vanguard Apex deal now, if he ordered his legal team to pause the acquisition to investigate my cryptic warning, he would look weak. He would look like a coward who had been spooked by a bitter ex-wife. His competitors would smell blood in the water. His ego simply refused to let him back down. He convinced himself that my warning was nothing more than a desperate bluff. He rationalized that I was just trying to sabotage his victory because I was jealous of his success. He decided that the only way to truly silence me and prove his ultimate dominance was to push the deal through faster than originally planned. He needed the victory. He needed the headline. He needed to prove he was the smartest man in the room, sweating under the bright chandelier lights. Terrence pulled his cell phone from his tuxedo pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device. He ignored the frantic pleading from Chloe and Malik pacing aggressively towards a quieter corner of the ballroom. He dialed the direct emergency line for his lead corporate counsel. The moment the lawyer answered, Terrence did not ask for a risk assessment. He did not ask them to review the holding company's ownership structure or investigate the primary signatory as I had suggested. Instead, fueled by blind arrogance and a desperate need to protect his fragile ego, Terrence barked a set of aggressive, highly irrational orders into the receiver. He commanded his legal team to bypass the final rounds of due diligence. He explicitly ordered them to ignore the standard waiting periods and any remaining internal risk flags. He demanded they push the final merger paperwork through, blindly instructing them to execute the full transfer of his pledged collateral immediately. He shouted into the phone that he did not care what it took. The Vanguard Apex acquisition had to be locked, signed, and finalized by Friday morning to prove a point. The morning sun glared off the polished mahogany table in the center of the glass-walled boardroom. But the atmosphere inside Terrence's firm was already thick with aggressive, nervous anticipation. It was Friday, exactly 48 hours after the gala, and I knew precisely what was happening inside that room because my legal team had been monitoring every frantic, reckless communication his lawyers had sent over the past 2 days. True to his completely predictable nature, Terrence had ignored my warning entirely. Driven by a toxic cocktail of panic and a deeply bruised ego, he had bulldozed his own risk assessment department, demanding they finalize the merger documentation without conducting the mandatory final reviews. He was treating this acquisition like a life raft, completely unaware that he was strapping himself directly to an anvil. Before leaving my executive suite at Vanguard Apex, I took a moment to look out over the city skyline. For years I had allowed a man with half my intellect to dictate my worth. I had allowed myself to be hidden away, treated as an administrative afterthought, while he played the role of a financial titan. Today, I was not just dismantling his career. I was reclaiming the narrative he had stolen from me. I smoothed the lapels of my striking crimson-tailored suit, an outfit deliberately chosen to command absolute attention, and walked toward the private elevator. Inside the boardroom, Terrence sat at the head of the table, flanked by his senior managing partners. He was wearing his lucky custom-tailored power suit, projecting the image of a fearless conqueror who had just secured the deal of the decade. According to the internal audio feed my security team had discreetly established, Terrence was currently boasting to his colleagues with unchecked arrogance. He was loudly declaring that the boutique holding firm they were absorbing would instantly monopolize the Atlanta market, making them all incredibly wealthy. He bragged about his own ruthless negotiation tactics, claiming he had forced the anonymous sellers into a corner and dictated the final terms. He was basking in the admiration of his peers, soaking up their congratulations before the ink was even dry on the paper. He repeatedly checked his expensive watch, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the faceless corporate representatives who would officially hand over his crown. I expected a team of mild-mannered corporate attorneys carrying briefcases. He expected a sterile, quiet administrative handover. What he received was an absolute, undeniable display of force. Exactly at 10 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom did not just open, they were pushed wide and held firmly in place by two men in immaculate dark suits. It was the exact same private security detail that had pulled up to his estate in the black Escalades earlier that week. The sudden aggressive entrance of heavily built security personnel instantly suffocated the jovial celebratory mood in the room. The laughter of the senior partners died in their throats. Terrence stopped mid-sentence, his smug smile freezing on his face as a wave of deep primal confusion washed over him. He started to stand up, placing his hands flat on the table, his mouth opening to demand an explanation for the intrusion. He assumed these men were perhaps a highly unorthodox security measure taken by the sellers. I did not have time to voice his outrage. I walked through the open doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I moved with a slow, measured grace that instantly commanded the space. My posture was flawless, my expression entirely unreadable. In my right hand, I carried a thick, leather-bound folder embossed with the gold crest of Vanguard Apex. It was the master contract, the physical embodiment of his entire financial future. The sudden, profound silence that descended upon the boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. The senior partners, who did not know me personally, simply stared in shock at the sudden, intense shift in the room's power dynamic. They recognized the aura of a high-level executive, but they could not understand why I was flanked by private security. But Terrence knew me. I watched the exact moment his brain attempted to process the sheer impossibility of what his eyes were seeing. The color drained from his face, starting from his cheeks and moving all the way down to his collar, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. His mouth worked silently, trying to form words that his shattered mind simply could not supply. He looked at the security detail, then at the thick master contract in my hand, and finally at my face. The visceral terror radiating from him was palpable. He had spent the last 2 days aggressively convincing himself that my presence at the gala was a fluke, that my knowledge of his confidential bid was some sort of lucky, unexplainable guess. Now standing in his own boardroom, surrounded by his most important partners, he was brutally and violently stripped of his delusions. I did not say a word immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting the absolute reality of his destruction sink deep into his bones. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. I walked slowly down the length of the long table, navigating the space as if I had designed it myself. The partners watched me, completely mesmerized and entirely silent, sensing the dangerous electricity in the air. I reached the opposite end of the table, stopping directly across from where Terrence was standing. I placed the thick, leather-bound master contract onto the polished wood. The heavy, solid thud of the binder hitting the table sounded exactly like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. Terrence's chest was heaving. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks and the train was already completely upon him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. He finally managed to choke out a single sound, uttering my name, like it was a desperate plea for reality to reassert itself. His voice was trembling, entirely devoid of the booming, arrogant authority he had been projecting just moments prior to my arrival. The powerful executive who had called my mother to collect her useless daughter was now visibly shaking in front of his peers. I looked at him, my eyes cold and steady. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite, reassuring smile. I simply rested my hands lightly on the leather binder, letting the gold-embossed Vanguard Apex logo catch the light. The executives in the room remained completely frozen, holding their breath as they realized the woman standing at the end of the table was not an ex-wife here to cause a domestic scene, but the absolute architect of their impending corporate fate. I stared directly into Terrence's terrified eyes and prepared to execute the final maneuver. The heavy silence following the thud of the master contract did not last long. Terrence snapped out of his paralyzed state with a sudden violent jolt. He leaped out of his leather chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed loudly against the floor-to-ceiling glass wall behind him. The sharp smack echoed violently through the room, making several junior partners jump in their seats. Terence slammed his hands flat on the mahogany table, his face flushing a deep mottled red, as panic completely overrode his remaining sense of self-preservation. He pointed a shaking finger at me and began to scream. He did not address the boardroom at large. He yelled directly at the two massive security guards flanking the doorway, demanding they grab me and drag me out of the building immediately. He shouted that I was a bitter, deranged ex-wife who had been stalking him for days. He ordered his partners to call the police, claiming I had somehow fabricated fake corporate documents just to crash his career-defining moment. His voice echoed with a manic, high-pitched desperation. He was grasping at the last crumbling edges of his fabricated reality, needing the room to view me as an unstable emotional liability rather than the actual architect of his demise. The security personnel did not flinch. They did not even blink. They remained perfectly positioned by the heavy frosted doors, their hands folded neatly in front of them, answering only to my silent authority. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. I did not justify my presence or argue against his pathetic accusations. I simply stood at the end of the long table and watched him completely unravel. The other executives in the room remained absolutely dead silent. These were seasoned financial veterans, men who had spent decades analyzing risk and reading the room. They looked at Terence's sweat-drenched face, and then they looked at my perfectly unbothered posture. They looked at the heavy gold-embossed Vanguard Apex binder resting confidently under my hands. They were rapidly calculating the facts in front of them, and none of those facts supported Terence's hysterical narrative. The senior managing partner of the firm, a distinguished older man named Reginald, who had mentored Terence for years, finally broke the tension. Reginald had built his lucrative career on recognizing power dynamics, and he saw exactly who controlled the oxygen in this room. He ignored Terence completely. He did not ask if Terence was okay, and he did not order his own building security to move. Instead, Reginald slowly stood up from his seat near the head of the table. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, moving with deliberate professional caution. Terence turned to his mentor, his eyes wide and frantic, expecting immediate backup. He practically begged Reginald to call the lobby guards and have me forcibly removed so they could get back to signing their monumental merger. Reginald did not even look at him. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on me. He walked past Terence's discarded overturned chair and pulled out the primary executive seat at the absolute head of the mahogany table. With a slow, formal gesture, Reginald offered the chair to me. The entire boardroom collectively held its breath. Terence let out a strangled, gasping sound, his brain completely unable to process the blatant betrayal of his own senior partner. He demanded to know what Reginald was doing, screaming that I was just a useless, stagnant charity case who had lost her mind. My chief acquisitions director, Jamal, stepped through the glass doors, moving smoothly past the security perimeter. Jamal carried a sleek silver briefcase and walked directly to my side. He did not spare a single glance for Terence. He addressed Reginald and the gathered partners with crisp, undeniable authority. Jamal smoothed his tie and announced to the room that there seemed to be a severe miscommunication regarding the identity of the acquiring entity. Jamal formally introduced me to the silent boardroom. He stated my full name with sharp, precise enunciation. He declared to the room that I was the primary signatory, the sole founder, and the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The partners exchanged shocked, wide-eyed glances. The elite firm they had been desperately trying to merge with the incredibly lucrative boutique holding company that was about to save their entire financial quarter was entirely owned and operated by the woman their colleague had just publicly discarded. The magnitude of their collective vulnerability washed over the table. Every single partner realized simultaneously that their professional futures, their yearly bonuses, and their firm's survival rested entirely in my hands. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking steadily against the hardwood. I did not look at Terence as I passed him. I approached the head of the table and gracefully took the premium seat Reginald had pulled out for me. I adjusted my posture, resting my arms on the armrests. and looking down the length of the room. I was sitting on Terrence's throne in the heart of his own territory, holding the deed to his entire existence. Terrence was hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically under his bespoke suit. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He stared at me sitting in the primary executive chair, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood that the convoy at his estate, the brutal encounter at the restaurant, and the devastating display of wealth at the corporate gala were not theatrical stunts. They were the very real manifestations of a massive empire I had built entirely without him. Terrence stood frozen, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself upright. His eyes darted from the gold-embossed logo on the contract to the tailored crimson suit I wore, finally lingering on the calm, steady expression on my face. For 7 years he had conditioned himself to view me as a subordinate creature, a quiet fixture in his home, who existed solely to applaud his mediocre achievements. He had genuinely believed that my silence was a symptom of simple-mindedness. He never considered for a single fraction of a second that my silence was actually the calculated restraint of an apex predator observing her prey. The senior partners shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. They were men who worshipped capital and despised liability. Right now, Terrence was the biggest liability any of them had ever seen. Reginald cleared his throat, a dry scraping sound, in the incredibly quiet room. He addressed me directly, his tone layered with profound respect and a desperate need to salvage his firm's standing. He offered his sincerest apologies for the highly unprofessional outburst from his junior colleague. He assured me that Vanguard Apex held their utmost respect and that they were fully prepared to execute the merger under whatever terms I deemed appropriate. Hearing his own mentor grovel to me was the final devastating blow to Terrence's fractured psyche. A wet, desperate sound escaped his throat. He lunged forward, reaching across the polished wood as if he could physically snatch the contract away and rewind time. The 2 security guards at the door moved instantly, stepping forward with terrifying synchronized speed, but I raised a single hand. My subtle gesture halted them in their tracks. I did not need physical protection from Terrence. His power had always been an illusion built on my willingness to let him lead. Now that I had withdrawn my grace, he was nothing but a hollow, desperate shell. I looked at Reginald, acknowledging his apology with a slow nod. I told him that in business, true leadership requires a thorough understanding of exactly who sits across the negotiating table. I opened the thick leather-bound master contract and smoothed the crisp pages flat against the table. I retrieved a custom silver fountain pen from my pocket, setting it deliberately next to the signature line. I turned my attention back to Terrence, who was now visibly sweating, his perfectly styled hair falling wildly out of place. I told him to sit down. I did not yell. I gave a simple, quiet command, but the authority in my voice carried the weight of a multi-million-dollar guillotine. Terrence slowly sank into a nearby chair, his knees giving out as the gravity of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He stared at the master contract, his chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged gasps, waiting for me to deliver the final killing blow. I settled back into the premium leather executive chair, anchoring myself at the absolute head of the mahogany table. The vantage point offered a perfect view of the 14 senior partners who were currently holding their collective breath. I let my eyes sweep across the room, making deliberate eye contact with each man present. For 7 years I had poured his coffee, nodded at his corporate dinners, and played the invisible wife, while these exact men praised his supposed brilliance. None of them had ever bothered to ask me a single substantive question about my own mind. They had all blindly accepted Terrence's narrative that I was merely a passive, uneducated accessory. Now they were entirely trapped inside my boardroom, staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. I turned my focus back to Terrence. He was slumped in his seat, looking physically ill. His hands rested flat on his thighs, trembling uncontrollably. I placed my fingertips on the open master contract and began to systematically dismantle his entire reality. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring every syllable resonated with crisp, undeniable authority. I told him that an apex predator does not need to roar to prove its dominance. A true predator simply controls the environment so completely that its prey never even realizes it is being hunted until the trap snaps shut. I explained that Vanguard Apex was not a sudden overnight inheritance or a lucky windfall. It was an empire I had meticulously built from the ground up, utilizing the vast generational resources my mother Josephine and I controlled. I told him that while he was busy spending his weekends golfing and blowing capital on flashy imported cars to impress his brother Malik, I was quietly acquiring majority stakes in the most lucrative logistics and technology sectors across the Southeast. I had intentionally structured my holding company in the shadows, employing rigorous non-disclosure agreements and layered corporate trusts to maintain absolute anonymity. I did this because I recognized very early in our marriage that his fragile ego would violently self-destruct if he ever discovered his wife was exponentially wealthier and vastly more intelligent than him. Terence tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. He stammered, asking how it was mathematically possible for me to own the exact boutique tech holding firm he had been aggressively pursuing for the last 6 months. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that offered him absolutely zero comfort. I told him it was not a coincidence. I explained that I had purposefully directed my board to acquire that specific target firm the moment I realized he was desperate for a cornerstone merger to save his floundering quarterly metrics. I knew he was arrogant enough to pursue it without conducting proper due diligence if he thought he was beating his competitors to the punch. I set the bait directly in his path, and his blinding greed did the rest of the work. The senior managing partner, Reginald, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Reginald attempted to interject, offering a frantic, stuttering explanation that their firm was still a highly valuable asset and that this merger would mutually benefit both entities. I did not even look at Reginald as I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I told the room that Vanguard Apex had zero interest in merging with a firm that operated on such reckless, unstable principles. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I looked directly at Terence and delivered the second devastating revelation. I informed him that my mother and I did not just possess a controlling interest in the company he was trying to buy. Over the last 48 hours, while he was busy bragging to industry stakeholders at the corporate gala and forcing his legal team to bypass standard risk assessments, my acquisitions department had been extremely busy. We had systematically contacted his largest creditors. I stated with absolute chilling clarity that Vanguard Apex had quietly bought up the entirety of his current firm's leveraged corporate debt. A collective gasp echoed around the boardroom table. Several junior partners physically sank into their chairs, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what I had just said. We did not just own the company Terence wanted to buy. We now legally owned the massive, suffocating debt of the company he currently worked for. We owned him coming and going. He was completely surrounded by walls I had built with my own hands. Terence gripped the edge of the table, his breathing turning into shallow, rapid wheezes. He looked like a man drowning in a desert. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his total ruin. He asked me why I was doing this to him. He tried to invoke the 7 years of our marriage, begging me to remember the life we had shared. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I reminded him of the Sunday dinner. I reminded him of the manila folder he had tossed onto my lap and the way he had laughed with his white sister-in-law Chloe while calling me a useless, stagnant underachiever. I told him that I was simply cleaning up my financial portfolio by liquidating a toxic liability. I reached across the polished wood and placed my hand on his thick, aggressive merger bid. This was the document his legal team had frantically finalized against all standard corporate protocols. It was the document that outlined his absurd, inflated offer to buy my firm. I slid the heavy stack of paperwork back across the table. The pages made a sharp hissing sound as they slid over the mahogany, stopping right at the edge of his space. I looked Terence dead in the eye and delivered my official ruling. I told him that his offer was fundamentally flawed and based on incredibly reckless mezzanine financing. I stated that, as the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, I was officially rejecting his merger bid. I declared loudly enough for his entire board to hear that his proposal was denied on the explicit grounds of gross financial incompetence. Terence stared at the rejected bid, his entire world collapsing into dust. He whispered that without this merger, his career was completely over. He told me that his partners would strip him of his equity and vote him out of the firm by the end of the day. He begged me to just reject the deal and walk away, leaving him to pick up the pieces of his shattered professional life. I picked up my silver fountain pen, turning it slowly between my fingers. I told Terence that he was fundamentally misunderstanding the severity of his current predicament. Rejecting the deal was only the administrative first step. The true consequence of his arrogance lay in the specific terms he had desperately agreed to just to secure a seat at my table. I reminded him of the strict non-negotiable collateral demands my board had instituted before we even allowed him to submit his final paperwork. I leaned back in the executive chair, locking my gaze onto his terrified face. I informed Terence that because he had blindly pledged his offshore investment accounts, his luxury vehicles, and the deed to his sprawling Atlanta estate as personal collateral for a failed aggressive bid, he was now in severe structural default. I kept my voice perfectly steady as I delivered the final absolute strike. I told him that I was officially triggering the default clause, and Vanguard Apex was immediately seizing his home and every single asset he owned. The reality of those words slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Terence physically collapsed back into his chair, his spine completely giving out as the absolute finality of his ruin took hold. The aggressive, confident posture he had maintained for the entirety of our 7-year marriage evaporated in a matter of seconds. He clutched at his chest, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps, as his brain tried and failed to process the magnitude of his loss. By triggering the default clause, I was not simply pulling out of a corporate merger. I was legally and instantly seizing every single asset he had recklessly tied to his aggressive bid. His offshore accounts, his luxury vehicles, his heavily leveraged stock portfolio, and the sprawling Atlanta estate where he had publicly humiliated me were all officially transferring into the Vanguard Apex Holding Trust. He was entirely destitute. The senior partners, seated around the long mahogany table, reacted with the brutal efficiency of seasoned financial predators. They did not offer Terence a glass of water. They did not offer him a moment of sympathy. The men who had been toasting to his brilliance just 20 minutes ago immediately recognized him as a toxic, catastrophic liability. I watched them physically shift their expensive leather chairs away from him, creating a visible, undeniable barrier of isolation. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom opened one final time. The quiet click of heels against the hardwood floor signaled her arrival before she even stepped fully into the room. My mother Josephine walked past my private security detail, moving with the immaculate, unbothered grace of a woman who commanded empires. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression radiating pure analytical focus. She did not rush. She took her time walking down the length of the boardroom, stopping to stand directly behind my executive chair. She rested her hands lightly on the back of my seat, projecting a unified, unbreakable front of generational power. Terence looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and wide with sheer panic. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for mercy, or to attempt one last pathetic negotiation, but Josephine did not allow him the privilege of finding his voice. She looked down at him with a cold, detached gaze that could freeze boiling water. She spoke with perfect, crisp articulation, ensuring every single partner in the room heard the absolute destruction in her words. She reminded him of his phone call on Sunday evening. She calmly recounted how he had put her on speakerphone in front of his family, eager to display his dominance. She noted how he had arrogantly demanded that she drive to his estate to collect her charity case of a daughter, boasting that a high-powered executive could no longer be shackled to mediocrity. Josephine tilted her head, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She told him that she was a woman who always honored her obligations. She stated that she had indeed come to pick up her daughter exactly as he had requested. She simply decided to purchase his entire existence while she was at it. A strangled, pathetic sound escaped Terence's throat. He looked toward Reginald, the senior managing partner, who had mentored him for his entire career, desperately seeking a lifeline. He pleaded with Reginald, claiming that he could fix this, that he just needed a temporary advance from the firm to cover the margin call and stabilize his accounts. He begged his mentor to remember the millions in revenue he had generated for them over the years. Reginald stood up from the table, adjusting his suit jacket with absolute clinical detachment. He looked at Terence not with pity, but with profound disgust. Reginald stated that the firm was built on calculated risk and strategic operational dominance, not on the reckless, frantic gambling of an egomaniac. He informed Terence that by pledging cross-collateralized assets and attempting to bypass standard due diligence protocols, he had directly violated the foundational ethics of their partnership agreement. Reginald did not raise his voice, but his decree was absolute. He officially stripped Terence of his title, his equity, and his partnership status. He declared that Terence was terminated effective immediately. Terence reached out a shaking hand, trying to grasp the edge of the master contract resting in front of me. But Jamal, my chief acquisitions director, smoothly pulled the leather-bound folder out of his reach. Reginald pressed a button on the boardroom intercom and summoned the building's internal security team. He instructed them to immediately escort the former partner off the premises and to ensure his keycard access was permanently revoked. Within seconds, 2 building guards entered the room. They lacked the tailored sophistication of my private detail, but they moved with swift, unyielding purpose. They approached Terence, gripping him firmly by the arms and hoisting him out of his chair. Terence did not fight them physically, but he began to babble uncontrollably. As they marched him toward the frosted glass doors, he looked back at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure devastation. He realized in that agonizing final moment that he had actively financed his own destruction. He had handed me the absolute legal authority to render him homeless, and he had done it with a smug smile on his face. I remained perfectly still in the primary executive chair, watching the heavy doors swing shut behind him. The sound of his desperate pleading faded down the corridor as he was paraded past the glass-walled offices of the junior analysts who had once idolized him. The walk of shame through his own corporate headquarters was the final nail in the coffin of his manufactured superiority. Terence was shoved unceremoniously into the main elevator, the guards standing silently beside him as the carriage descended toward the ground floor. He leaned against the mirrored wall of the elevator, completely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity. When the polished metal doors slid open at the lobby level, he stumbled forward, expecting to be thrown out onto the unforgiving Atlanta pavement. Instead, he was immediately intercepted by a frantic, chaotic scene. Standing in the center of the expansive marble lobby were Malik and Chloe. They looked completely unhinged. The heavy gold designer dress Chloe had worn to the gala was gone, replaced by whatever wrinkled clothing she had managed to throw on in her state of sheer panic. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes wild with exhaustion. Malik was pacing aggressively, clutching a thick stack of finalized termination notices from the Savannah Port Authority. The moment they spotted Terence stepping out of the elevator, they rushed toward him like desperate refugees spotting a rescue ship. Chloe grabbed Terence's arm, her manicured fingernails digging desperately into the fabric of his suit. She was practically hyperventilating as she screamed that her entire logistics business had just been seized and liquidated. Malik shoved the termination papers into Terence's chest, begging his younger brother for an immediate emergency bailout. Malik shouted that his own real estate portfolio was collapsing because of the margin calls and that they needed Terence to transfer the funds from his new massive merger before the bank seized their home. They were clinging to him, demanding the financial salvation he had so proudly promised them all week. They stared at him with desperate, pleading eyes, completely unaware that the man they were begging for a lifeline no longer even owned the shoes on his feet. My husband tossed our signed divorce papers onto my lap during Sunday dinner and confidently told his wealthy family that he was finally taking out the trash. He actually snatched my phone and called my mother on speakerphone, demanding she come pick up her useless daughter because he was tired of funding my pathetic existence. He wanted to break me. He wanted a show. But the smirk completely melted off his face when 5 custom black SUVs tore up his pristine driveway exactly 2 minutes later. Before I reveal how I systematically dismantled his entire corporate empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant man exactly who he is dealing with. Growing up in a household built on quiet strategy and generational wealth, my mother Josephine taught me that the loudest person in the room is always the weakest. For 7 years of my marriage to Terrence, I played the role of the submissive, unassuming wife. I wore muted colors. I smiled politely at his corporate dinners. I let him believe he was the undisputed king of his castle. Terrence was a senior partner at a prominent Atlanta private equity firm, and his fragile ego required constant, exhausting nourishment. He needed to feel like the absolute provider. So I hid my brilliance. I hid my status. I let him think my remote consulting job barely paid for my groceries. I dimmed my light so his could shine, and my reward was a front-row seat to his relentless cruelty. The Sunday dinner at his parents' sprawling Atlanta estate was always an exercise in deep psychological endurance. The house was a monument to new money drowning in flashy chandeliers and imported marble floors that echoed every single condescending remark. Terrence sat at the head of the heavy mahogany dining table swirling an overpriced glass of bourbon. He bought that specific bottle just to impress his older brother Malik. Malik was a man who rode Terrence's coattails at every opportunity, sitting there with a permanent self-satisfied smirk. Beside Malik sat his wife Chloe. Chloe was a white woman who had married into the family and immediately adopted this insufferable performative air of cultural authority. She loved to treat me like a fascinating charity project. I sat quietly between them wearing a simple beige cashmere sweater picking at my roasted vegetables. I was invisible. I was compliant. I was exactly the version of me that Terrence thought he owned. Terrence cleared his throat loudly. The clinking of silverware stopped. He wanted an audience for his grand performance. He did not ease into his betrayal. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick manila folder, and tossed it directly across the table. It slid over the polished wood and hit my lap with a heavy, definitive thud. I looked down. The divorce papers were already signed on the final page in his aggressive, sprawling handwriting. The silence in the dining room was thick and suffocating. I looked up from the folder to his face. Terrence took a slow sip of his bourbon and smiled. It was a cold, practiced expression he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. He announced to the entire table that he was officially cutting his losses. He puffed out his chest and proclaimed that he was on the verge of a massive career-defining acquisition at his firm. He told his family that a high-powered executive simply could not be weighed down by a stagnant underachiever. He looked me dead in the eyes and called me a financial burden. He said I lacked the drive, the vision, and the intellect necessary to stand beside a man of his rising caliber. Malik chuckled softly. He shook his head in agreement as he sliced into his steak, thoroughly enjoying my public humiliation. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her tone was dripping with that specific brand of sweet, toxic condescension she reserved exclusively for me. She let out a dramatic sigh and said that some women just are not built for the corporate hustle. She told me there was absolutely no shame in returning to a simple, quiet life. She even suggested I look into basic administrative work, maybe finding a nice, quiet receptionist job where I would not feel so overwhelmed by the intense demands of a wealthy, successful household. They all waited for the breakdown. They sat there with bated breath, eager to watch me crumble. Terrence wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg him to reconsider. He wanted a spectacular, messy scene so he could justify his narrative of me being a weak, emotional liability. He wanted to feel like a god discarding a peasant. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I calmly reached for my crystal glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, deliberate sip, allowing the cold liquid to ground me. I placed the glass back onto the coaster with a soft click. I looked at Terrence with an expression of pure, unbothered detachment. My total lack of a breakdown deeply irritated him. His grand theatrical moment was falling entirely flat because I refused to play the role of the devastated victim. Enraged by my absolute silence, Terrence stood up from his chair. He reached across the table and violently snatched my phone from right next to my plate. He unlocked it with aggressive force, holding it up like a hunting trophy. He declared that since I was too stunned and pathetic to speak for myself, he would do me the ultimate favor. He announced to the room that he was going to call my mother to come retrieve her charity case. This was his ultimate trump card. He wanted to embarrass me in front of the woman who raised me. He tapped the screen aggressively, finding my mother Josephine in my contacts. He hit the speaker button and set the phone back down in the absolute center of the dining room table. The dial tone echoed loudly against the high ceilings. Chloe covered her mouth to hide a giddy laugh. Malik leaned in closer, his eyes wide, eager for the show to begin. They fully expected a panicked, struggling mother on the other end of the line. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the women in my family. For 7 years, I convinced myself that shrinking my presence was an act of love. I wore muted colors, spoke softly, and hid my entire financial empire just to protect the fragile ego of a man who ultimately viewed me as completely disposable. I thought that by making myself small, I was keeping our marriage safe. But the greatest lesson I learned from watching Terrence utterly destroy his own life is that you can never shrink yourself enough to make a toxic person respect you. When someone is fundamentally committed to misunderstanding your value, your only obligation is to stop auditioning for their approval. I realized that true power does not need to shout across a crowded dining room. It does not need to throw tantrums or hurl insults to prove it exists. Terrence and his family operated on loud noise, aggressive posturing, and the desperate need to belittle others just to elevate themselves. They mistook my quiet compliance for weakness, never understanding that a queen does not need to declare her sovereignty to a court of jesters. Moving in absolute silence gave me the ultimate advantage. It allowed me to build an unassailable fortress, while they were busy playing with fragile sandcastles. The most satisfying part of this entire ordeal was not seizing my ex-husband's assets or watching his absolute professional ruin. It was the profound realization that I did not have to actively destroy him. I simply stepped out of his way and let the heavy consequences of his own profound arrogance crush him. When you strip away the protection you have been freely giving to people who mistreat you, they will almost always finance their own destruction. You do not need to seek revenge when you can simply enforce boundaries and let accountability do the heavy lifting. To any woman out there who is currently hiding her brilliance, downplaying her success, or swallowing her pride, just to keep the peace at a table where she is not valued, it is time to stand up. Stop lowering your standards to accommodate people who refuse to raise theirs. Your worth is never determined by those who lack the intellectual capacity to see it. Claim your space, build your empire, and never apologize for being exactly who you are. Have you ever had to walk away from a table where your worth was no longer being served? Tell me your story in the comments below, and please hit that like and subscribe button if you are ready to stop shrinking and start building your own undeniable empire.